Hi YouTube. This is going to be a very short video because I'm in the middle of painting my kitchen. But I have already dealt with the issue of the Liverpool care pathway, but something came up in the papers yesterday which means that I would like to add a little bit to what I said before, or what my husband said. You can see from this Mail Online headline that hospitals were set targets, and it says here of 2/3 of all deaths should be on LCP, on the Liverpool care pathway, in other words. And they allocated £30 million of extra money to hospitals to achieve these goals. Now, I've read letters in the paper, quite a lot of them from doctors, saying that the Liverpool care pathway, the end-of-life pathway as they call it, is supposedly, it's there to give people who are terminally ill a dignified end, and an end which involves less suffering. So I want to examine that in the light of what we've been told in the headline in yesterday's paper. I repeat, it says some hospitals were set a target of 2/3 of all deaths, and 2/3 of all deaths should be on the Liverpool care pathway. Well, logically, that means that 1/3 of deaths should not be on the Liverpool care pathway. So let's take that as a starting point. Now, I have no idea how many deaths there would be in a hospital per month, but I'm just going to take a figure out of thin air, and I'm going to say 60 people died in hospitals that were not terminally ill. Let's say, people who had suddenly had heart attacks or were in road accidents, that kind of thing. 60 people die, that's 1/3. So that means that 120 people have to be put on the Liverpool care pathway. Right, let's say that 120 people die other than being terminally ill. 120 people is 1/3, so we have to have 240 people in that situation on the Liverpool care pathway. That's the way I look at it, and it seems to me that this is an incentive to kill people, because who is to say that there are going to be 240 people in the hospital that month who would be terminally ill and would need to be on the Liverpool care pathway? This is just, to me, it's a little bit like the banking system. When you put money in a bank, when you deposit money in a bank, a lot of people are now beginning to realise that the bank can loan out up to 10 times the amount of money that you deposit or depositors put in the bank. And that's known as the fractional reserve system. And this is why we have such a Ponzi scheme now, where there's so much money being created out of thin air. Well, it seems to me that this Liverpool care pathway is exactly the same in terms of death. It's a fractional reserve system of murdering people. Basically, the deposit is the number of people who die from things like heart attacks and road accidents, and that is fractionally reserved. There has to be twice the number of people who die on the Liverpool care pathway. So I just do not understand how they can justify this. And I'd like you to examine again the story of this lady who went into hospital with a simple urinary tract infection and was put on the Liverpool care pathway and died. Now, her daughter only discovered this because she happened to read the notes which had been left on a hospital window ledge. So, if this is so innocent, why is it that relatives, in this particular case, were not informed and were not involved in the decision-making process? It seems to me that this smells very bad indeed. Now, these were targets that were introduced to the hospital, and the way that targets work is that the institution is given the targets by the government, And there is a sort of cascading system, it's called management by objectives, in which departmental objectives are then based on the corporate objectives, and individual targets in their turn are based on the departmental targets. So you should have had a system in the hospitals whereby, the targets were communicated to departments, and department heads must have discussed them and must have gone along with it. And individuals must have had individual targets related to this. So individuals must have been told, you have to ensure that the 10 people die on the Liverpool care pathway each month. Otherwise, you won't get a pay rise. And you just have to ask yourself the question, where's the morality gone in this country? I mean, everybody accepts targets in the workplace, and, very often we don't believe in them, but how many of us would go so far as to kill people in order to have a pay rise? Because that's what it amounts to, actually. And, you just got to look at the paedophile stories that are coming out now to see just how corrupt our government is. And if I can find the time, I will make a video about that next. Just to give you some background into the case that I've been talking about, you may well have heard my husband talk about it on the previous video, but if you didn't, it's worth listening to.
Take the case of Phyllis Nichols, who was murdered in a hospital. Murdered by the doctors, murdered by the doctors legally. She was taken to hospital with a simple urinary infection. One day her daughter found that she'd been moved to a side room where her hospital notes, which had been left on a windowsill, said at the top ELP, which stood for End of Life Pathway. This story, which is so, on the one hand, prosaic, and on the other hand, chilling, really leaves me cold. The mother had said to the daughter that she had heard about this ward and feared that she would not get out alive, and indeed she didn't get out alive because the doctors removed her fluid drip so that she slipped away. Now, the opinion of this daughter is this pathway, as they call it, are being seized on by doctors, I quote, as a means of clearing elderly patients from hospital.